Hello, computer science students. Welcome back. In this video, in our series on advanced class concepts, we're going to continue working on our student class. We briefly discussed at a pretty high level what static does for fields in our last video, and now we're going to dive into and use a static field and see what it does, while also learning about overloading. So let's start by overloading our constructor. So what is overloading? Overloading is creating something with the same setup, the same return type and name, but different inputs. So as far as a constructor is concerned, the constructor I just created here on line 16, public student, open and close parentheses, this is a constructor for my class. So is public student, int ID, string last name, string first name. Both of these are constructors for my class, and they can both exist. Now, before I dive into the using static and things like that, I want to talk about overloading. Our two constructors, now that we have overloads, both exist, and the key is when you create a student, you can now use either constructor. So if I do new student 3 or student 3 equals new student, and I put nothing in parentheses, this is going to be fine. Java allows it. And what will happen is Java looks at all the constructors and it says, all right, well, we have a constructor that has no inputs. So when I see no inputs, I will call that constructor. When I see an int, a string, and a string, then I will call this constructor, the original constructor that we had created. And so the idea here is we can create different constructors or different methods with the same name, same return types, but different inputs, and they will handle the different inputs, well, differently. So for us, we don't want to just do blank for a student. Having a blank student entered is no good. But we do want to be able to create a student where we control the ID number, but then last name and first name can be provided. So to do that, we're going to make an overloaded constructor that just takes two strings, a last name and a first name. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second here and talk about something. Our first constructor takes 3 arguments. One is the ID. That allows the person who uses our students to tell us how many or what the student's ID is, which allows potentially some dangerous situations like this where we have 2 of the same ID. Now I'm going to write a constructor that just takes in a last name and a first name, and so we are going to set the ID ourselves. And so the key to this, the way that we're going to be able to do this is using this next ID. Since this belongs and has one variable for all the objects I create, as long as I manage and maintain this next ID correctly, I can provide each student their own unique ID. So let's start by doing the easy part. Let's do, and actually just as a reminder, maybe as a heads up or new thing, if you didn't read my tips and tricks video or watch my tips and tricks video, we have a last name in our constructor here that is the exact same name as a field. And so within the constructor, if we want to be able to reference one or the other, typing this dot last name allows us to reference the field, and just typing last name or using last name allows us to access the variable, the input passed in. So we're going to take in a string to last name and save it in our class in the class's field. So this dot last name equals last name, and this dot first name equals first name. Now the last issue we have to take care of, the last field we have not addressed, is ID. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that ID equals next ID, and then I'm going to say that next ID plus plus, or plus equals 1, or equals next ID plus 1, right? All these things mean the same thing. I guess ultimately I personally would prefer the shortest way of writing it, which would be just be next ID plus plus. And so the idea here is that when we create a student, we give a first name and last name. The system, kind of the class itself, assigns for the very first student an ID of 1,000, and then it increments ID to 1,001. Now this next ID variable is, like I said, there's only one for all the objects you create. So when I change this to 1001 from one object, it's going to be 1001 for all objects. When I create the next one, it'll use 1001 and increment to 1002. So that's one really good use of static. Now let's make sure that this works. So let's do, I got rid of the Connie book student, and instead we're going to create Connie book the new way. So book Connie. So we'll enroll Connie as a student, and we'll have me, who I added using an ID that I created, 1, and Connie book using that next ID variable, because the Connie book student is going to be created using this overloaded constructor here. And so let's print the ID of both students I've created, make sure that this is working the way I think it is. So let's do an S out, system.println of student 1 dot get ID, right? I want to be able to print out my ID, and student 2 dot get ID. Okay, so let's run our tester code here. All right, so the ID of student 1 is 1. When I created Ryan Matfield, I had a student ID of 1, and the ID of student 2 is 1000, because I initialized the next ID to 1000 at the start here. That's where I decided I wanted my student IDs to start. Maybe I want all 4-digit IDs, and this is a good way to start that. I don't know, it doesn't matter. People come up with their own preferences for how they create starting IDs. But I created my students, they have IDs. So let's do one more thing before we leave this video, so I can talk about static one more little piece. Let's create one more student to show that this works. We'll do student 3 equals new student. Let's see, what's a good non-political name? I will just do John Smith. I don't know. We don't want to get political here. We're here for computer science and for learning. So we're going to use just a, I guess, generic name, John Smith, and create the student, and then let's see what happens with the student ID. Okay, so I'm going to create John Smith, and I'm going to get his ID. His ID is now 1001, because after I assigned an ID to Connie Book, I updated next ID to be 1001, and all of my students all have the same next ID variable, and it's going to be updated every time I update it from any of my students. So now that I've created John Smith, if I create another student, he or she would have an ID of 2002, and then 2003, and then 2004, and then 2005, right? Or sorry, wow, I'm doing 2000s. 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. So as we go up, it's just going to keep incrementing our ID counter, and eventually we will, make it to 10,000 and 20,000 and 100,000 and 400,000, whatever. It'll keep going up as long as we keep adding students. So this one static variable applies to all objects in the class, not just one object in the class. And any object that updates it for all objects. So come back next time and we will chat about overloading methods.